When discussing the massive global conflict of World War II, heavy artillery and standard-issue rifles usually dominate the conversation. However, the devastating close-range stopping power of the combat shotgun proved absolutely vital in trenches, dense jungles, and urban combat. Today, we are cataloging and explaining every single shotgun utilized during this brutal global conflict. United States first, we have the Winchester Model 1897. This 12-gauge pump-action shotgun featured a 5-round tubular magazine and an exposed hammer. It was originally designed by the legendary firearms inventor John Browning late in the 19th century. The weapon possessed no trigger disconnect, allowing soldiers to slam fire by holding the trigger and pumping the action rapidly. It was incredibly devastating in the dense jungles of the Pacific Theater, where close-quarters combat was constant. The United States military issued over 65,000 of these deadly weapons throughout the war. Next, we have this Winchester Model 1912. It was a 12-gauge pump-action shotgun that held 6 rounds in its tubular magazine. Unlike its predecessor, it utilized a sleek internal hammer design, which made it far less likely to snag on equipment or brush. The United States military purchased nearly 80,000 of these shotguns during the conflict. They saw extensive use in both combat roles and guard duty across multiple theaters of the war. Its smooth, reliable action made it a highly favored weapon among American troops. Let us continue with this Stevens Model 520-30. This was another 12-gauge pump-action shotgun initially designed by John Browning around 1903. It fed from a 5-round tubular magazine and featured a highly distinctive humpback receiver profile. The United States military acquired over 33,000 of these rugged weapons for service. While mostly assigned to military police and rear echelon guard units, they did see frontline action. The shotgun was highly valued for its robust takedown design, allowing it to be easily transported. Next, we have that Stevens Model 620A. It maintained the 12-gauge chambering and the 5-round pump-action capacity of the earlier model. However, the designer smoothed out the distinctive humpback receiver to create a more streamlined and modern profile. Over 12,000 of these shotguns were produced and issued to the United States military during the war. They performed the exact same combat and guard duties as the older 520-30 models. The streamlined design simply offered a slightly more snag-free handling experience for the modern soldier. Next, we have this Ithaca Model 37. It was a lightweight 12-gauge pump-action shotgun that held 4 rounds in its magazine tube. Its most notable design feature was its bottom ejection port, which kept dirt and mud out of the internal action. This bottom ejection also made the weapon incredibly friendly for left-handed shooters in the field. The United States military procured fewer than 2,000 of these prior to the war ending. Despite the low numbers, it was considered a highly reliable and desirable weapon for close-range encounters. Let us continue with this Remington Model 10. This was an older 12-gauge pump-action shotgun that carried 5 rounds in its tubular magazine. Designed by John Pedersen, it originally saw service back in the First World War before being pulled from storage. The United States military utilized roughly 3,500 of these shotguns during the Second World War. Because of their age, they were almost entirely relegated to stateside guard duty and training purposes. It served as a vital placeholder weapon to free up more modern shotguns for frontline combat. Next, we have that Remington Model 11. Operating on a long recoil system, it fired 12-gauge shells and held 5 rounds in a semi-automatic action. It was essentially a domestically produced version of the famous Browning Auto 5 design. The military utilized over 55,000 of these semi-automatic weapons throughout the conflict. Their primary purpose was aerial gunnery training, where soldiers used them to shoot clay pigeons to simulate firing at moving aircraft. They were also occasionally issued for riot control and base security across the nation. Next, we have this Remington Model 31. It was a 12-gauge pump-action shotgun featuring a 5-round tubular magazine capacity. This weapon was widely celebrated for having an incredibly smooth, almost ball-bearing-like pump action. The military purchased nearly 9,000 of these shotguns to bolster their small arms inventory. They were utilized extensively by aerial gunners for training and by various military police units. Its exceptional reliability made it a strong favorite among those who were issued the weapon. Let us continue with this Remington Sportsman. It shared the exact same 12-gauge semi-automatic long recoil action as the Model 11. The primary difference was that its magazine capacity was strictly limited to 3 rounds to comply with civilian migratory bird hunting laws. The military acquired a significant number of these restricted capacity shotguns for specialized training regimens, like the standard model. They were absolutely critical for teaching aerial gunners how to track and engage fast-moving aerial targets. It proved that even civilian hunting weapons could serve a vital military training purpose. Next, we have that Savage Model 720. This was yet another 12-gauge long recoil semi-automatic shotgun that held 5 rounds. The United States Army Air Forces purchased roughly 14,000 of these weapons, directly mirroring the Browning Auto 5 design. They were put to use in the exact same aerial gunnery training programs as the Remington models. Soldiers would stand in the back of moving trucks and shoot clay targets to learn the principles of leading a moving target. It was a highly robust weapon that withstood the rigorous daily abuse of military training. Next, we have this Savage Model 745. It remained a 12-gauge semi-automatic shotgun operating on the proven long recoil system. To reduce the overall weight, the manufacturer replaced the heavy steel receiver with a lightweight aluminum alloy receiver. This reduction in weight made the weapon significantly easier for trainees and instructors to handle all day on the firing line. The military purchased a small number of these specifically for their ongoing gunnery training programs. It represented an early military experiment with lightweight alloys and standard firearms. Let us continue with this Winchester Model 21. This was a premium quality, side-by-side double-barrel shotgun chambered in 12-gauge. It was an exceptionally expensive and finely crafted sporting arm, not intended for harsh trench warfare. The military purchased a very small quantity of these to be included in aircraft survival kits for downed pilots. They were intended to be used for hunting small game to ensure survival in remote areas. Some were also retained for recreational use by high-ranking generals and military elites. Great Britain and Commonwealth. First, we have this Browning Auto 5. Designed by John Browning, this 12-gauge weapon held 5 rounds and operated on a long recoil semi-automatic system. The British military acquired these shotguns to help arm their Home Guard forces during the severe weapons shortage early in the war. Later, they proved highly effective in the dense jungle environments of the Malayan campaign against Japanese forces. The rapid semi-automatic fire provided devastating ambush capabilities for Commonwealth patrols. It remains one of the most successful sporting and combat shotgun designs in human history. Next, we have that Greener police gun. It utilized a highly robust Martini Henry-style falling block lever action mechanism. It was specially chambered to fire a proprietary 14-gauge shell featuring a specialized bottleneck design. This unique ammunition prevented stolen weapons from being loaded with standard commercial civilian shotgun shells. They were issued primarily to colonial police forces, prison guards, and secondary defense units across the British Empire. It offered a highly rugged, incredibly reliable, and theft-resistant solution for internal security. Let us continue with this Winchester Model 1897. Following the disastrous evacuation of Dunkirk, the British faced a massive shortage of small arms. To quickly arm the Home Guard against a potential German invasion, they purchased thousands of these 12-gauge pump-action shotguns from the United States. They featured the same exposed hammer and 5-round capacity as their American counterparts. These weapons gave local defense volunteers significant close-quarters firepower to defend their towns and villages. They were essential stopgap weapons during Britain's most desperate defensive hour. Next, we have this Winchester Model 1912. Alongside the 1897 models, the British Purchasing Commission also bought bulk quantities of these internal hammer pump actions. They fired the standard 12-gauge shell and held 6 rounds in the tubular magazine. These were distributed across the United Kingdom to fortify the local defense forces and airfield security units. The smooth pump action allowed volunteers to lay down a rapid wall of lead against potential paratrooper assaults. They served honorably as defensive weapons until more standard military rifles could be produced. Nazi Germany. First, we have this Sauer Sohn M30 Luftwaffe drilling. This was an incredibly elaborate break-action combination gun issued purely for survival. It featured 2 12-gauge shotgun barrels positioned over a single 9.3mm rifle barrel. They were exclusively issued to Luftwaffe bomber crews operating over the remote and hostile environments of North Africa. The weapon was strictly intended for hunting wild game so downed pilots could survive behind enemy lines. It was arguably the highest quality and most expensive survival weapon issued by any military during the war. Let us continue with this Walther Glock Model 1918. This was a fascinating and highly complex 12-gauge semi-automatic shotgun. It utilized a unique toggle lock mechanism that visually resembled the famous Luger pistol action. Designed during the First World War, a small number of these weapons remained in the German inventory. They saw very limited use during the Second World War, mostly issued to rear echelon security forces and prison guards. The design was ultimately deemed too complicated and sensitive to dirt for widespread frontline military adoption. Soviet Union first, we have this TOZ-B double-barrel shotgun. This was a traditional side-by-side break-action shotgun featuring exposed external hammers. They were most commonly chambered in 16-gauge or 12-gauge and were widely owned by civilian hunters before the war. When the German army invaded, these weapons were heavily utilized by Soviet partisan fighters operating deep behind enemy lines. They were brutally effective for sudden close-range ambush attacks against German supply convoys and patrols. It was a classic example of a simple sporting weapon being repurposed for desperate guerrilla warfare. Next, we have that IZH-5. This was a basic single-barrel break-action shotgun that was extremely cheap to manufacture. Originally intended as an affordable hunting and foraging tool for rural Soviet citizens, it quickly became a weapon of war. Desperate local militias and resistance fighters used whatever firearms they could find to defend their homes. While a single-shot shotgun is hardly an ideal combat weapon, it was capable of lethal damage at very close ranges. It highlights the absolute desperation and total war mentality of the Eastern Front. France. First, we have this Manufrance robust number 32. This was an incredibly popular internally hammered side-by-side double-barrel shotgun. Chambered mostly in 12 or 16 gauge, it was a staple hunting weapon across the French countryside before the occupation. Following the devastating fall of France, these civilian shotguns became vital tools for the French resistance underground. Maquis fighters used them to silently assassinate German sentries or to conduct devastating hit-and-run ambushes in urban environments. It was a common, unassuming weapon that struck fear into the occupying forces. Let us continue with this darn sliding breech shotgun. Unlike traditional break-action double barrels, the barrels on this weapon remained completely fixed in place. To load the 12 or 16 gauge shells, the user pulled a lever that slid the entire breech block backward. This unique mechanism made the weapon incredibly strong and remarkably quick to reload for a double-barrel shotgun. Like other civilian weapons, these were heavily utilized by partisan fighters to harass German supply lines and outposts. It remains one of the most mechanically interesting sporting shotguns ever pressed into combat service. Next, we have those Graz Model 1874 shotgun conversions. These started their lives as massive, obsolete 19th century bolt-action military rifles. To stretch limited resources, many of these antique rifles had their barrels bored out and smoothed to fire standard shotgun shells. As the threat of war loomed, the French military pulled these modified antiques from deep storage facilities. They were issued to desperate local defense forces and second-line guard units to free up modern rifles for the front line. It was a true act of desperation to arm troops with converted black powder-era weaponry. Italy first, we have this Beretta Model 412. This was a very lightweight single-barrel break-action shotgun, typically chambered in 12 gauge. Its most defining feature was a unique hinge mechanism that allowed the entire barrel to fold completely underneath the stock. This folding capability made it incredibly compact and easy to stow inside a rucksack or vehicle compartment. Italian forces utilized these primarily as utility weapons for foraging wild game to supplement their meager combat rations. It also served as a lightweight, emergency self-defense weapon for guards and rear echelon personnel. Imperial Japan. First, we have this Murata shotgun. As the Pacific War turned decisively against the Japanese Empire, their military supply chain completely collapsed. In a state of absolute desperation, obsolete 19th century Murata bolt-action rifles were brought out of storage. The military bored out the rifling to convert these antique bolt-actions into crude smoothbore shotguns. They were issued to civilian volunteer defense forces and isolated island garrisons facing imminent American invasion. These converted antiques were intended for extreme close-quarters defense, highlighting the dire situation of the Japanese military in the final days of the war.